World War II was the largest military conflict in human history, and it ran on oil. From September 1939 to August 1945, millions of vehicles, ships, aircraft, and tanks operated simultaneously across every continent except Antarctica. The sheer magnitude of this mechanized warfare created an unprecedented demand for petroleum products that would dwarf anything the world had seen before. This was no longer the war of horses and railroads that had characterized World War I. This was total mechanized warfare, and it demanded fuel on a scale that would reshape global economics and geopolitics for generations to come. The transformation had been building since the 1920s. Military strategists had watched with keen interest as internal combustion engines revolutionized transportation. The tank, introduced tentatively in World War I, had evolved into a dominant battlefield weapon. Aircraft had progressed from fragile reconnaissance tools to powerful bombers and fighters. Naval vessels had transitioned from coal to oil, gaining speed and operational range. By 1939, every major military power understood that the next war would be won or lost based on petroleum. American forces alone produced roughly 6 billion barrels of oil during the war years, an achievement that represented approximately two-thirds of global oil production at the time. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and California operated around the clock. Refineries worked at maximum capacity, converting crude oil into the various grades of fuel needed for different military applications. Aviation gasoline required higher octane ratings than vehicle fuel. Naval vessels used thick bunker fuel. Tanks needed diesel. The complexity of meeting these diverse demands while maintaining sufficient production volume was itself a logistical marvel. American forces consumed approximately 7 billion gallons of gasoline in 1945 alone, the final year of the conflict. This figure represented just one type of petroleum product used by just one nation in just one year. It didn't account for diesel fuel, aviation fuel, naval fuel oil, or the petroleum products consumed in earlier years of the war. When we expand our view to encompass all Allied and Axis powers across all 6 years of global conflict, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. To understand the daily consumption, we need to look at the peak operational periods when all major powers were fully engaged in combat operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. The year 1944 stands out as the period of maximum consumption. By this point, the war had reached its most intense phase. Operation Overlord had launched the liberation of Western Europe. The Soviet Union was pushing Germany back on the Eastern Front. The Pacific saw massive naval battles and island-hopping campaigns. Strategic bombing reached its crescendo over Germany and Japan. Every front demanded fuel, and lots of it. During the height of the war in 1944, the Allied forces combined were consuming an estimated 1 million barrels of oil per day. That's 42 million gallons daily, or about 290 million gallons per week. To visualize this quantity, imagine a stream of fuel flowing continuously, wide enough and deep enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 12 minutes. That stream flowed without pause, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, month after month. The Axis powers, though severely constrained by limited oil reserves and increasingly disrupted supply lines, were still consuming hundreds of thousands of barrels daily at their operational peak. Germany's synthetic fuel program, which converted coal into liquid petroleum products, represented one of the most ambitious industrial efforts of the war. Even with this program operating at full capacity, Germany never had sufficient fuel to meet military demands. Romania's Ploesti oil fields, which supplied much of Germany's natural petroleum, became prime targets for Allied bombing raids, precisely because of their strategic importance. Breaking down consumption by individual machines helps illuminate the scale. A single B-17 Flying Fortress bomber consumed approximately 200 gallons of fuel per hour of flight. A typical bombing mission over Germany might last 8 to 10 hours, meaning each B-17 burned through 1,600 to 2,000 gallons per mission. The United States alone operated over 12,000 B-17s during the war. On days when major bombing raids were conducted, hundreds of these aircraft would be airborne simultaneously. A single 1,000-plane raid could consume 2 million gallons of aviation fuel in one day. Ground forces proved equally thirsty. The M4 Sherman tank, the workhorse of American armored divisions, achieved less than 1 mile per gallon of fuel and carried 175 gallons in its tanks. With a combat range of about 120 miles, a Sherman required frequent refueling. American forces deployed roughly 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. When an armored division went into action, it might have several hundred tanks moving together, each burning through fuel at a prodigious rate. A single day of combat could consume tens of thousands of gallons just for the tanks, not counting the fuel trucks, jeeps, and other support vehicles that accompanied them. Naval operations consumed even more fuel in absolute terms. A battleship like the USS Iowa could burn through 100 tons of fuel oil in a single day of high-speed operations. That's approximately 25,000 gallons daily for one ship. Aircraft carriers, which not only moved themselves, but also had to carry aviation fuel for their embarked squadrons, consumed similar quantities. The United States Navy operated hundreds of major warships, supported by thousands of auxiliary vessels. Task forces conducting operations in the Pacific might include dozens of ships, collectively consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons daily. Transport aircraft added another layer to fuel consumption. The Douglas C-47, which served as the primary cargo and troop transport, burned about 100 gallons per hour. These aircraft flew supply missions constantly, moving men and materiel across vast distances. During the Berlin airlift immediately after the war, C-47s and their larger cousins demonstrated the scale of air transport operations, flying thousands of missions to supply a blockaded city. Similar operations during the war, though less publicized, consumed comparable amounts of fuel. The logistics of simply moving fuel to where it was needed consumed fuel itself. Tank trucks, which hauled gasoline from depots to frontline units, burned diesel to make their deliveries. Ships that transported fuel across oceans consumed fuel oil to power their engines. Trains that carried petroleum products from refineries to ports required coal or diesel. This recursive consumption meant that for every gallon of fuel that reached a combat unit, additional fuel had been expended in the supply chain. When we multiply these individual consumption figures by the thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of warships, and millions of trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles in operation across all theaters of war, the numbers become staggering. The global military machine was consuming fuel faster than large cities consumed water. It was an industrial metabolism of unprecedented scale, burning through millions of years of stored solar energy in the form of petroleum within just 6 years of conflict. The infrastructure required to support this consumption was itself massive. Oil tankers formed convoys across the Atlantic, brave merchantmen risking U-boat attacks to deliver crude oil and refined products from American fields to European battlefields. Pipelines were laid across deserts and through jungles. Storage tanks were erected at remote island bases and forward airfields. Refineries operated at maximum capacity, their cracking towers working day and night to transform crude oil into the specific products military forces required. This was the scale of World War II's fuel consumption, an all-consuming appetite that touched every aspect of the conflict, from grand strategy to individual tactics, from national economies to personal sacrifice through rationing. It was a war fought as much in oil fields and refineries as on battlefields, a conflict where petroleum was as decisive as ammunition, where running out of gas could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Understanding this scale is essential to comprehending how modern warfare fundamentally changed in the 20th century and how the quest for energy resources would shape international relations for decades to come. Fuel wasn't just consumed by the war, it dictated how the war was fought. Every major strategic decision made by military planners and national leaders had to account for petroleum availability. The location of oil fields influenced invasion routes. The capacity of refineries determined the scale of operations. The vulnerability of supply lines shaped defensive strategies. In many ways, World War II was not simply a war that used oil. It was a war fought for oil, a conflict where access to petroleum reserves became as important as access to weapons factories or manpower reserves. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was partially motivated by the need to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus region. While Hitler's ideological hatred of communism and his desire for living space in the East were primary motivations, the strategic calculus included a desperate need for oil. Germany's own petroleum production was negligible. The Nazi war machine depended on imports from Romania and on synthetic fuel from coal, neither of which proved sufficient for sustained operations on multiple fronts. The southern thrust of the German invasion in 1942, aimed at Stalingrad and beyond toward the Baku oil fields, represented Germany's last serious attempt to solve its oil crisis through conquest. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad not only cost Germany an entire army, but permanently closed off access to Soviet oil. From that point forward, Germany would fight an increasingly defensive war, always constrained by fuel shortages that limited mobility and operational flexibility. Japan's situation was even more desperate and more directly tied to oil. In 1941, Japan imported approximately 80% of its oil, with the majority coming from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. When the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed oil embargoes on Japan in response to its aggression in China and Indochina, Japanese military planners faced an impossible choice. They could withdraw from China and accept humiliation, or they could seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia by force, which would mean war with the Western powers. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, must be understood in this context. It was not merely an act of aggression, but a calculated strike designed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to secure the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and Burma. The entire Pacific War was, in many ways, a struggle for oil resources in Southeast Asia. Japan's initial victories in early 1942 gave them control of these crucial oil fields, but they never managed to transport sufficient quantities back to Japan due to American submarine warfare and air attacks. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping represents one of the most successful applications of naval power in military history, and its target was primarily petroleum. By 1944, American submarines had sent hundreds of Japanese tankers to the bottom of the Pacific. Japanese oil imports, which had reached several million barrels per month in early 1942, had been reduced to a trickle by 1945. This strangulation of Japan's oil supply effectively ended its ability to conduct offensive operations and contributed significantly to its eventual surrender. Germany faced chronic fuel shortages throughout the war, despite heroic efforts to overcome them through technology and industrial mobilization. The synthetic fuel program, which used the Fischer-Tropsch process to convert coal into liquid hydrocarbons, represented a massive investment of resources and scientific expertise. By 1944, German synthetic fuel production had reached approximately 124,000 barrels per day, supplementing the natural petroleum from Romanian fields. This was an impressive technical achievement, but it was nowhere near enough. The shortages manifested in countless ways on the battlefield. German pilots sometimes sat grounded with perfectly functional aircraft that couldn't fly for lack of aviation fuel. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, became increasingly ineffective, not primarily because of pilot losses or aircraft production problems, but because of fuel rationing. Pilots received fewer training hours, reducing their combat effectiveness. Operational sorties were limited, allowing Allied air forces to gain superiority by sheer volume of missions. Panzer divisions, the armored spearheads that had blitzed through Poland and France, were increasingly immobilized by fuel shortages. In the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, fuel shortages proved catastrophic. German planners had counted on capturing American fuel depots to sustain their advance. When this didn't happen, entire tank columns ran dry and were abandoned. The offensive stalled, not primarily because of American resistance, though that was fierce, but because German tanks literally ran out of gas within sight of their objectives. The contrast with American fuel availability was stark. American forces in Europe operated with the confidence that fuel would be available when needed. This didn't mean supply was unlimited or that shortages never occurred, but the underlying assumption was fundamentally different. American commanders could plan operations based on tactical and strategic considerations without constantly worrying whether their tanks would have fuel to move or their aircraft could fly. The Soviet Union, despite being a major oil producer, also faced significant fuel challenges. The loss of the Caucasus oil fields would have been catastrophic, which is why the defense of this region received such high priority. Soviet oil production during the war reached approximately 300,000 barrels per day during peak operations, though this figure fluctuated based on battlefield conditions and the evacuation of facilities ahead of German advances. Soviet logistics were simpler in some ways than Western armies. Soviet tanks used diesel fuel, which was easier to produce and transport than the high-octane gasoline required by many German and American vehicles. Soviet aircraft were designed to operate on lower-grade fuel than their Western counterparts. This practical approach to engineering, born of necessity, meant that Soviet forces could maintain operations even when fuel quality was inconsistent. Britain required roughly 200,000 barrels of fuel per day to maintain its military operations and essential civilian economy. As an island nation with minimal domestic oil production, Britain depended entirely on imports, primarily from the United States and the Middle East. The Battle of the Atlantic, the prolonged struggle between Allied convoys and German U-boats, was fundamentally about keeping these supply lines open. If Germany had succeeded in cutting Britain's oil imports, the war would have ended differently. The Middle East emerged during World War II as a region of critical strategic importance precisely because of its oil reserves. British forces fought in North Africa and the Middle East not just to protect the Suez Canal, but to secure oil fields in Iraq and Iran. German advances toward the Caucasus were matched by attempts to reach the Middle Eastern fields through North Africa. The failure of Rommel's Africa Corps to break through at El Alamein in 1942 ensured that Middle Eastern oil would continue flowing to Allied forces. The logistics of delivering fuel were as important as producing it. American tankers crossed the Atlantic in massive convoys, dozens of ships moving together for mutual protection against U-boat wolf packs. Each crossing took weeks, and losses were significant, particularly in 1942 and early 1943. The men who crewed these tankers faced the terrifying prospect of torpedoes igniting their cargo, turning their ships into floating infernos. Their courage and persistence were as crucial to Allied victory as the bravery of frontline troops. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles across hostile territory and open ocean. From American refineries to European battlefields involved multiple stages: refinery to port, port across the Atlantic, European port to supply depot, depot to forward supply point to combat unit. Each stage had to function smoothly, or the entire system broke down. The complexity of managing these global supply chains, coordinating schedules, allocating shipping capacity, and prioritizing between competing demands represented a logistical challenge of unprecedented scope. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, required meticulous fuel planning that began months before the first troops landed. Planners calculated that advancing armies would need millions of gallons of fuel per day once they broke out of the beachhead. Conventional supply methods through ports couldn't possibly deliver sufficient quantities fast enough. The solution was Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, which laid underwater pipelines across the English Channel to pump fuel directly from England to France. In the first 3 months after the Normandy landings, Allied forces laid over 3,000 miles of pipeline across France to carry fuel from the beaches to advancing armies. This pipeline network, built under combat conditions while armies were still fighting, represented an engineering achievement comparable to building the Panama Canal. Without this infrastructure, the liberation of Europe would have stalled somewhere in France, armies immobilized by lack of fuel, while victory remained tantalizingly out of reach. The strategic importance of fuel created new vulnerabilities and new targeting priorities. Allied bombing campaigns against Germany increasingly focused on synthetic fuel plants and oil refineries. The massive raid on Ploiești, Romania, in August 1933 specifically targeted oil production facilities. These bombing campaigns were costly, with high aircraft losses, but they directly attacked Germany's ability to wage war. Every gallon of fuel production destroyed was a gallon that couldn't power a tank, fly a fighter, or move a truck. Fuel shaped strategy at every level,
from the grand movements of armies to individual tactical decisions on the battlefield. It influenced the timing of offensives and the sustainability of defenses. It created dependencies and vulnerabilities that clever opponents could exploit. Understanding World War II requires understanding oil, because oil was not just a resource consumed by the war, it was a factor that fundamentally shaped how the war was fought and ultimately who won it.
By 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany from both east and west, the daily fuel consumption reached its absolute peak. The war had become a race against time, with multiple fronts demanding maximum effort simultaneously. American forces in Europe alone were using approximately 1 million gallons of gasoline per day, a figure that would have seemed incomprehensible just a few years earlier. The Pacific Theater, with its vast naval operations stretching across thousands of miles of ocean and strategic bombing campaigns against Japan that required aircraft to fly unprecedented distances, consumed hundreds of thousands more gallons daily. The scale of consumption in the final year of the war reflected not just the intensity of combat, but the accumulated effect of 6 years of industrial mobilization. Armies had grown larger, more mechanized, and more mobile. Air forces had expanded exponentially. Naval fleets included not just combat vessels, but vast armadas of support ships, tankers, and transport vessels. Every aspect of military operations had become more dependent on petroleum products, and the logistical systems supporting these operations had evolved into the most complex supply networks ever created. General George S. Patton's Third Army, racing across France in August 1944, following the breakout from Normandy, exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of mechanized warfare. Patton's armored and motorized divisions were consuming approximately 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day as they pursued retreating German forces. The advance moved so quickly that supply lines couldn't keep pace. Trucks hauling fuel from Normandy beaches to frontline units had to travel hundreds of miles, and there simply weren't enough trucks to maintain the flow.
When the fuel ran out in early September 1944, Patton's advance stopped abruptly. His tanks sat immobilized, his trucks couldn't move, his momentum evaporated. This wasn't a failure of tactics or a collapse of morale. It was pure logistics. No fuel meant no movement, regardless of how weak the enemy or how favorable the tactical situation. Patton raged against the supply officers, but the mathematics were unforgiving. You cannot drive tanks without gasoline, no matter how brilliant your generalship. The competition for limited fuel supplies created tensions between Allied commanders. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands received supply priority in September 1944. Which meant less fuel for Patton's Third Army. These allocation decisions were agonizing. Every gallon sent to one army was a gallon denied to another. Commanders lobbied and argued for priority, understanding that fuel meant the ability to attack, to exploit opportunities, to win victories. Fuel determined the speed of victory in the most literal sense. The famous Red Ball Express, an American truck convoy system established in August 1944, operated 6,000 vehicles around the clock to deliver 12,500 tons of supplies daily from Normandy to advancing armies. Much of this cargo was fuel. The Red Ball Express drivers, predominantly African-American soldiers in segregated units, drove in convoys along designated routes, maintaining a relentless pace that left no time for rest. They drove through the night, often under blackout conditions, navigating damaged roads and occasionally under enemy fire. The consumption rate of the Red Ball Express trucks themselves was substantial. These vehicles burned fuel to deliver fuel, an inefficiency that was unavoidable given the distances involved. The system worked, but it was a temporary expedient until better solutions like pipelines could be established. The existence of the Red Ball Express demonstrated both American logistical capability and the desperate measures necessary to keep armies supplied when they outran their supply lines. Soviet forces advancing from the east faced similar challenges, but approached them differently. Soviet logistics emphasized railroads over trucks, which was more fuel efficient for moving large quantities of supplies. However, this approach meant Soviet armies were tied to rail lines and moved more methodically than their American counterparts. When Soviet forces did conduct rapid armored advances, they faced the same fuel constraints. The Great Soviet Offensives of 1944 and 1945 required massive stockpiling of fuel beforehand, with depots established along anticipated routes of advance. The British Army, operating in Northern Europe alongside American forces, managed its fuel supplies with characteristic efficiency born of necessity. British fuel reserves were always tight, and waste was not tolerated. British vehicles were generally more fuel efficient than their American counterparts, though often less powerful. The British emphasis on careful planning and methodical advance reflected not just tactical doctrine, but also the reality of operating on a tighter fuel budget than the Americans. Japan's situation by 1945 was desperate beyond measure. American submarines and aircraft had reduced Japanese oil imports to virtually nothing. The few tankers that attempted to run the gauntlet from the Dutch East Indies to Japan rarely made it through. Japanese refineries, starved of crude oil, operated far below capacity when they operated at all. The synthetic fuel programs Japan had initiated came too late and produced too little to matter. The impact on Japanese military operations was catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific in early 1942, kept most of its remaining vessels in port by 1945 because there was no fuel for operations. The super battleship Yamato's final sortie in April 1945, a one-way suicide mission toward Okinawa, received barely enough fuel for the trip, with no possibility of return. This ultimate expression of desperation demonstrated how completely fuel shortages had crippled Japanese naval power. Japanese aircraft increasingly sat unused on airfields, not because there were no pilots or no planes, but because there was no aviation fuel. The few kamikaze missions that were launched operated on minimal fuel, often just enough for a one-way trip to the target. The concept of the kamikaze attack, while rooted in Japanese military culture and desperation, was also a practical response to fuel shortages. If aircraft couldn't return anyway due to lack of fuel, might as well use them as guided missiles. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan consumed enormous quantities of aviation fuel, but served multiple purposes beyond destroying Japanese cities. Each B-29 superfortress, flying from the Marianas Islands to Japan and back, consumed approximately 7,000 gallons of fuel per mission. With hundreds of B-29s conducting regular raids, the daily fuel consumption just for the bombing campaign reached into the millions of gallons. This represented a crushing application of American industrial and logistical superiority, demonstrating to Japan that America could burn more fuel conducting bombing raids than Japan had available for its entire military.
The contrast between American fuel abundance and Japanese fuel starvation illustrated the outcome of the war as clearly as any battle. America's ability to maintain massive fuel consumption levels while Japan's military starved for petroleum reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity, resource access, and logistical competence. Wars are won by many factors, but in World War II, fuel logistics proved decisive. Calculating the total fuel consumption for all combatants throughout the entire war requires aggregating incomplete records and making informed estimates for periods and theaters where documentation is sparse. The best estimates suggest that over 7 billion barrels of petroleum products were consumed during the war. That represents roughly 294 billion gallons when converted to liquid measure. This figure includes all types of petroleum products: gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, naval fuel oil, and various specialized lubricants and fluids. Dividing this total consumption across 2,194 days from September 1, 1939 to September 2, 1945 yields an average daily consumption of approximately 134 million gallons globally. However, this average obscures significant variations over time. The early war years saw lower consumption as armies mobilized and operations remained limited in scope. The final 2 years, when operations were at their most intense across all theaters simultaneously, saw daily consumption easily exceed 150 million gallons worldwide, and likely approached 200 million gallons on peak operational days. To put these figures in perspective that modern audiences can grasp, consider that a Boeing 747 commercial airliner burns approximately 4,000 gallons of fuel on a typical transcontinental flight from New York to Los Angeles. The daily fuel consumption of World War II at its peak could have powered roughly 37,500 such flights every single day. Imagine the skies filled with hundreds of fully loaded jumbo jets, all flying cross-country simultaneously. And then imagine sustaining that level of flight operations continuously for years. That approximates the scale of World War II's petroleum appetite. Another comparison, a typical American household today uses about 1,000 gallons of gasoline for personal vehicles. The daily petroleum consumption of World War II could have supplied the annual gasoline needs of 150 million American households. Every single day, the war consumed as much fuel as would normally serve the transportation needs of a population larger than the United States for an entire year. The environmental impact of burning this quantity of petroleum was significant, though largely unrecognized at the time. Millions of tons of carbon dioxide and other combustion products entered the atmosphere. Oil spills from sunken tankers polluted oceans. Fuel dumps and leaked petroleum contaminated soil and groundwater across multiple continents. The environmental legacy of World War II's fuel consumption persists in some locations to this day, though it has been overshadowed by post-war industrial pollution. The experience of World War II fundamentally transformed how military planners thought about petroleum. The importance of secure oil supplies, the vulnerability of long supply lines, and the decisive advantage conferred by superior fuel logistics became core principles of military doctrine. Post-war military planning assumed that future conflicts would be even more fuel-intensive, driving demand for jet fuel, specialized lubricants, and petroleum-based materials. The geopolitical consequences extended far beyond military considerations. Control of oil resources became a central concern of Cold War strategy. The Middle East's importance in global politics stemmed directly from lessons learned during World War II about petroleum's strategic value. American foreign policy in the latter half of the 20th century cannot be understood without reference to the fuel logistics of World War II and the conclusions drawn from that experience. It was an ocean of petroleum burned in the furnace of total war. Those millions of gallons consumed daily represented stored solar energy from millions of years of prehistoric biological activity, released in just 6 years of unprecedented violence. The scale was staggering, the impact profound, and the lessons enduring. World War II proved that modern warfare is fundamentally about logistics, that fuel is as important as ammunition, and that the ability to sustain massive consumption of petroleum products over extended periods determines victory as surely as tactical brilliance or strategic vision.